Welcome to the EDPS Talks, an exclusive initiative of the European Data Protection Supervisor as part of its initiatives to celebrate the institution's 20 years anniversary of protecting personal data. The talks aim to gathering leading voices from all around the world to share their unique perspectives on data protection and privacy, and how this shape their respective fields. In today's talk, it's an honor to discuss these topics with our guest, Mr. Paul Ash, Chief Executive at the Christchurch Foundation. If you don't know it, the Christchurch Call was established in the aftermath of 2019 of the Christchurch terrorist attack in New Zealand. It is a collaborative effort between government, tech companies, and civil society to try and prevent terrorists from using social media to amplify their attacks. Recent news also announced the launch of the Christchurch Call Foundation, to which Mr. Ash has been just appointed Chief Executive. While the initiative focuses on countering terrorism and violent extremism online, we will dive into their perspective on data protection and privacy. Thank you, Mr. Ash, for joining us today. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Sonia. It's a pleasure to be with you, and congratulations to the EDPS on its 20th anniversary of successful operation.
Thank you very much. Let's proceed with the first question. As a privacy and data protection authority, we usually start this talk with a very personal question. What is privacy to you? How do you apply it in your everyday life?
Well, it's a great question. I've worked in the cyber and digital field now for well over a decade, and it's at times hard to separate everyday life from work. But from a personal perspective, I think privacy is very much a case of the choice to decide, having the ability to decide who owns, who holds, who uses information about you, and who can share that information for similar purposes. Having come from a cybersecurity background, one of the key tenets of information security is this question of the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information. And that work really shapes my thinking about privacy. I tend to ensure that while I have social media accounts and information that I have to be able to put out in public, I tend to be very, very careful about the settings I use for those accounts and the way that those settings are maintained and managed. That makes quite a big difference to the way that I ensure my accounts are managed. I tend to, over the years, to have spent quite a bit of time building policies and running public information campaigns around that. And I am very, very careful around that these days. I guess that goes to the question of the challenges being associated with some of the work I do these days around online harms, around people being abused online, violence against individuals being promulgated online. And if I think back to the Christchurch attacks, one of the key things there really was the privacy and the violation of privacy of all of those involved in the attacks at an extraordinarily difficult moment. And really, in one sense, that's one of the most shocking manifestations of an abuse of privacy that you could ever hope to imagine. If I look more broadly at the New Zealand context, we've been on rather a journey since our Privacy Act was enacted, and it has developed and evolved through a couple of major updates and iterations. It's probably still got some way to go, but one of the key things we've been able to do here in New Zealand is ensure over a number of years now that we have sustained and maintained an adequacy finding with the European Union's own framework, with GDPR. And I was very pleased prior to GDPR being passed to have the opportunity to work with colleagues in the European Commission on the last stages of that adequacy finding and of being able to advocate for a common set of privacy and data management practices across New Zealand and the European Union when I returned to work here in Wellington from my time in Brussels. And I think that's been one of the really key things that has helped to build and sustain a strong relationship, particularly as we think about things like digital trade, as we think about New Zealand and the European Union working together. That adequacy finding might not be well understood or recognised, but it's actually been a fundamental underpinning to that relationship.
Indeed, very important, the adequacy decision for the relationship between New Zealand and Europe. Let me now go to the second question. The Christchurch Call has 25 commitments made by governments and online service providers to eliminate terrorist and extremist content online. How will you approach privacy and data protection as a representative of the Christchurch Call and now also as of its foundation?
Well, thank you, Sonia. That's a great question. I guess privacy is one of the key tenets that sits right at the core of what we do in the Christchurch Call. And to illustrate how, it might be helpful to go back to 2019 when the call was first created and launched. Just over 5 years ago, a terrorist here in Christchurch, the city where I happen to be today, committed an attack on 2 mosques here in Christchurch. And he live streamed the murder of 51 worshippers who were peacefully going about their Friday midday worship, and did so for over 17 minutes online. That video was designed to go viral, and it did so with the help of others in a way and at a speed and scale that we'd never seen before, and thankfully we've never seen since. What we saw at the time was that tech platforms were not really prepared to deal with the scale and the speed at which the content spread. And so here in New Zealand, we decided we needed to do something about that. And we needed not just regulation, because while that would have had an effect, it would have probably been a blunt instrument at the time. But we needed tech companies, we needed other governments, and we needed civil society to work together, including with the Muslim community here in New Zealand, to try and address what had become really a hideous problem of terrorist and violent extremist content online. Today, I think we're stronger than ever in that work. The launch of the new foundation to keep that work going is a very good sign of that. And one of the reasons that we've been able to build a strong community committed to action around this is because we've taken an approach based on several key tenets. Those include the importance of a free, open and secure internet, right at the foundations of our work. They include the adherence to international human rights standards as a fundamental principle of our work, including the importance of respect for privacy and data protection. That was also based on the importance of a freedom of expression, which goes hand in hand with those things. People feel more able to be freely expressive when they know that their privacy and their data will be protected. And we took an approach based on multi-stakeholderism, that we could not solve for these problems just working with governments or tech firms alone. I guess as we've carried that work out, we've worked first from the principle that the violation of people's privacy started at the moment of the attacks and the live streaming of those. For many of those families involved, it has been distressing on an ongoing basis to be exposed to that content. And we've worked our way through that as we've thought through then the issues around how people's data is kept private online when it's held by firms or others, and how privacy is managed across a range of jurisdictions. And I guess one of the key things that's come out of this for the Christchurch Call community is this idea that privacy is sometimes thought to be a tricky challenge, a function of finding a balance between privacy and other considerations. Whether it's privacy or national security, privacy or content moderation, privacy or countering violent extremist content online. And our approach is very much that this isn't a binary or a zero-sum game. We want to make sure we uphold each of the core tenets that we have diverse voices around the table from civil society, from industry, from government, including experts and advocates on privacy, to ensure that as a community of interest, we're best able to tackle the problem of terrorist and violent extremist content online together. We're also working on a set of technical tools to better understand, for instance, pathways to radicalisation, the ways that people find themselves lured into and acting out on violent impulses. And right at the core of that work is the ability to use privacy enhancing technologies and modern cutting edge tools that enable us to preserve privacy at the heart of our technological solutions to the issue. That requires trust, it requires good technology, it requires really structured data protection at the core of the research that we need to do. But it's fundamental to trying to understand how people's data is held, owned, and curated, and the impacts that has on the internet, the humans that use it, and on our societies as a whole. You'll find the Christchurch Call, as it was built, had a range of legal protections for privacy built into it as part of the process, and we've done our best over the past 5 years to try and live those out in practice.
Indeed. Let me go to this point of technology that you just mentioned for our next question, because as you may know, the EDPS, apart from supervising European institutions, we also have a mandate to monitor technological developments in order to see their adequacy to the data protection legislation. The goal of the foundation is to maintain, as you have just said, a free, open, and secure global internet with a human-centered approach. These are values that we at the EDPS defend very strongly and very firmly as well. Now, the EDPS will soon become the supervisor for European institutions on artificial intelligence. So I would like to stop a little bit on this point and ask you to give us your perspectives on technological developments, especially in the field of artificial intelligence, and what are the risks and the challenges that you see for our democracies of this artificial intelligence that we're seeing?
Well, thanks. That's probably the pressing question of the moment, and something that we've seen really playing out in the development in the EU of regulatory measures like the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, and I have no doubt that over time the AI Act will need to be built upon and improved upon as we learn more about some of the impacts of AI. And indeed, the European institutions have really built themselves around and that legislation around an iterative process of trying to understand those impacts and adjust for them. We're doing much the same here in the Christchurch Call. So at the moment, the call is transitioning from being supported by one government and a secretariat in that government to a more resilient foundation structure, in part to manage some of the emerging challenges we're seeing around AI. We need, as do other institutions, to be able to innovate and adapt to meet the conditions of today's technology and to anticipate those of tomorrow's. And because we need to keep pace with change, we kind of need to continue strengthening our ability to work cooperatively and to iterate as we do so. I have no doubt that we will learn things about AI and its impacts on society that are surprising, and we will need to be able to adjust for that as we do so. One thing is becoming increasingly apparent, though, and that is that we are starting to see the impacts of some degradation of our information environments at the moment. Some of that is coming out of algorithmic curation, out of AI and machine learning. And we are learning some things as we start to see issues around recursive data, for instance. When AI starts to work on AI-generated data, it starts to become much more challenging to ensure the integrity of the outputs. Similarly, we are learning a lot about the type of data that AI is training on and the impacts that has on the outputs it delivers, particularly with the growth in the last year or so of large language models and generative AI tools. It's an area where there's an enormous amount of effort going into research and trying to understand those impacts, in part to ensure that the tremendous opportunities that those technologies offer can be deployed safely and in a way that enhances their benefits and makes sure that as much as possible those are available to all. But we are, certainly through the Christchurch Call work, concerned about the misuse of those technologies by violent extremist or terrorist groups, and in particular, the use of those technologies to more readily radicalise to violence or persuade people that it is in their interests to do so. As part of that, we have launched a work program on new technology, not just on AI, but on immersives, on artificial environments, and the use of AI in them. And we're particularly looking to hone in on some impacts on particular groups, particularly young people and the propensity for radicalisation to violence. We are also looking at the way disinformation and gender-based violence online have linked together some new and old forms of extremism and conspiracy communities, and some of those causal links between misogyny, rhetoric directed at the rainbow community, and political violence. We've also got a project underway to try and understand how users' online and offline worlds might intersect in ways that predispose towards radicalisation to violence, and then to look at designing positive interventions that can perhaps, on the flip side of the AI equation, leverage some of the benefits and opportunities that AI and technologies give us. And in particular, we're looking at the ability to reduce the impact on human beings of having to be involved directly in content moderation where content is already understood and known, to reduce the exposure of humans to that content, to think about ways to design AI-based tools that support and can curate and assist folk who are on that pathway towards radicalisation. And I guess that's partly a reflection of the fact that you have degraded information environments where all information is curated and it's hard to really understand how or why it's been curated that way. It can predispose users towards actions they might not otherwise have contemplated. And that leads to a resultant degradation, I think. And we're seeing some of these impacts now on the institutions and values that uphold human rights and modern, liberal, tolerant, democratic societies. We're, I guess, increasingly in that environment, working in a field where we can't be certain that existing safety interventions are going to continue to deliver the kinds of outcomes we need, and to continue to work as intended once adversarial actors, whether those are states, non-state, learn to circumvent them and to use AI tools to do so. So there's a real need, I think, as we've seen with recent EU regulatory work, to be outcomes focused, to leave a lot of room for supervisory agencies or intermediary bodies to look at building new solutions and being flexible about how they deliver outcomes. But as we do so, one of the things we're committed to in the Christchurch Call community, and I think we all need in human rights respecting modern democratic societies to retain, is a focus on those baseline standards, protecting human rights, a free, open and secure internet, and dealing with the scourge of particular harms as they crop up, in our case, terrorist and violent extremist content online. But really that's the sharp end, I think, of degradation of information environments and the impacts that has on social cohesion. And from the perspective of the Christchurch Call team, that's the issue that really is presenting for us at the moment, and front and centre as we try and think about the issue of violent extremist content.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ash, for explaining us all these interesting initiatives and everything you're doing. It's really important. Let me move from artificial intelligence and the concern on preserving the integrity of the outputs to content moderation now. I would like to ask you, Mr. Ash, what role does the Christchurch Call play in setting international standards for data protection while tackling online harm? How does the Foundation address privacy concerns when cooperating with tech companies to counter online extremism and balancing the need for effective online content moderation? You have given some hints to us in previous questions already, but let's tackle this specific balance on online content moderation now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you've hit on one of the key issues that we're all grappling with as we think about managing harmful content online. I guess I'd say for starters, content moderation is not a, a solution in and of itself to all of the issues that we're grappling with. It is a sign that we need to deal with some of the most extreme forms of content once they manifest online, and where they are known to be terrorist and violent extremist content online. And that's fundamentally a question for the tech platforms that run those services to deliver solutions to. It is something that I think there's a role for governments and others in standard setting around what that content might comprise, and things like designations and other approaches to and taxonomies to dealing with that are an important part of it. But there is a need for real care in that process, and you've alluded to this around ensuring that users' rights are maintained through this process, that people are able to express themselves freely and in a way that minimises harm to others. What I'd say about the call is it's not a standard setting body in the traditional sense. It has a set of 25 commitments voluntarily entered into that tech firms and governments undertake, and they're designed to ensure that those commitments have protections built into them. There are appeal rights for users. There are some very important elements in the call around protecting the ability of content to be placed up, and of maintaining a real balance and care as governments and tech firms go about the process of trying to keep users safe online. It also has a strong focus on prevention, that content moderation won't solve this problem on its own. And we need to be thinking carefully about prevention. And one of the really interesting projects there, I think, is the Call's initiative on algorithmic outcomes. The Call text commits platforms to studying how algorithms might play a role in driving users towards more extreme content, and to working collaboratively to try and solve for that problem when it happens. In practice, and doing that research requires access to some very sensitive data sets. It requires trust, and it requires strong privacy protections to be able to understand and do the research that provides an empirical basis for delivering policy solutions, whether those are content moderation, whether they are around positive interventions, or the sorts of things you see in a public health context around, for instance, suicide prevention, where searches for content around suicide lead to public health messages being delivered back. There's a lot of potential in the idea that we can see violent extremism, for instance, as a public health issue, and that radicalisation to violence is actually a health problem. And there are many efforts underway at the moment to try and provide solutions or test solutions that would work in that way. To do that, it's really important to understand user journeys and the way that individuals and algorithmic curation systems interact, and the type of content that is then served up to those individuals, in order to try and get a better empirical basis for building safe policy solutions. Sitting at the core of that is for our work, is a set of privacy enhancing technologies that we work in partnership with a consortium called OpenMind to deliver. To date, tech firms including Microsoft, Dailymotion, and Twitter have worked with OpenMind on research funded by New Zealand and US governments, with France now recently joining that initiative, to enable researchers to query real data sets, to put out a question and receive data back without actually having to have exposure to live user data, but to get empirical responses that then mean we have an understanding of how users are affected in their online experiences, and can design some solutions to help prevent radicalisation online. Scaling that is going to require quite a bit of effort, quite a bit of expertise and resources, but we think we're the first to actually develop and test a system like this across multiple large-scale social media platforms for public good and in a non-proprietary manner. We know others are developing some proprietary solutions. Our intent here is to try and do this as a community-wide effort in a way that can show collaboration is possible in this area and deliver good solutions. But fundamentally, it comes down to very, very good privacy-enhancing technologies and compliance with regulatory regimes across the Atlantic, something that I know has proven a challenging issue for everyone over time.
Thank you very much, Mr. You've talked about the dangers of rapid misinformation spread. How does the Christchurch Call reconcile the need for rapid content moderation with the right to due process and fair adjudication for content creators?
Thank you. That's a challenging and one of the most fundamentally difficult questions to grapple with. I think it's easier when you are dealing with content that is either generated by or the product of a designated terrorist entity, or where it plainly contravenes regulatory frameworks for terrorist content, either where it's um, showing violence directed at individuals and is doing so for an ideological purpose rather than, say, news gathering. We saw that in the Christchurch attack, and our first issue there as a community, whether a tech firm or the government's involved or even the most affected communities, was how do we get millions and millions of copies of the Christchurch terrorist video off of a myriad of tech platforms in a hurry, and to stop those from circulating or inspiring another attack. We know that the tech platforms worked incredibly hard to do this once they saw what had happened. And we know that that led to, I think, in the first 3 months, over 4 million copies of the Christchurch video being taken down from Facebook as a result of the content moderation. We know that others, YouTube and others, also put in place very quickly effective measures to try and deal with that and to try and manage the integrity of content that was being put up in the first place. It's much, much harder now to try and do something like the Christchurch attacker did. And we've put in place for crises really effective models for dealing with those. The tech firms have much better collaboration. We have a much better ability to work across a community when there is a crisis happening. To be clear, that's dealing with a very narrow category of content. And to the question around mis and disinformation and information integrity, that's a whole different category of difficulty because most of that content is lawful. Much of it has an absolute right to be out and about and visible to the public because it is not contravening any particular law. But we do know that over time it does cause some degradation in the information environment and can lead people towards content that is illegal. The solution to that may well not be content moderation, but may well be lie in a range of different areas, either counter speech, better education, interstitials, friction. And part of this lies in the fact that almost every online experience these days is curated. There is no such thing, I think, now as a non-curated online experience. Almost all the data that we receive when we're online comes through either an algorithmically generated or a machine learning generated experience, whether it's search, whether it's social media platforms. I guess a couple of things I'd say there. First, it is very important that platforms have in place to manage around content moderation issues, appeals processes, and a set of defined terms and conditions and rules so that users on the platforms understand exactly what it is that they're up for when they use that platform, and that they can rely on swift and consistent implementation of those terms of service. And if we saw that based on the terms of service that we see on most platforms these days, I think the internet would be a much, much safer place. To give them credit, platforms have, I think, come an awfully long way in the last 5 years in developing those terms and conditions and understanding the different cases of misuse that can occur and in setting their own parameters for what they're prepared to see in services they run. There's probably still some way to go as we understand more in more depth the implications of the technologies and the way they affect users. And that's something we'll keep working on in the Christchurch Call, but ensuring there's an appeal process there is embedded in the call and something that is critically important. I guess the last thing I'd say is, as we think about both content and crises, we're starting to see slightly different implications and different manifestations of crisis. And in recent months, certainly off the back of conflicts in Gaza and prior to that in Ukraine, we've actually seen a protracted lift in harmful content, in content depicting violent extremism or terrorism. And wrapped around that, the empirical evidence shows a huge lift in speech directed at particular communities in a hateful way. Anti-Semitic and Islamophobic content has grown several 100% in just about every market you survey. And that is a different type of, I guess, incident or crisis than we have been used to seeing, where we've had a sharp spike and then a long tail of content. In the Christchurch Call community, we're having to do some work to try and understand how best to operate in that environment, how to speak back into it, and how to find countervailing voices that will hopefully ensure violence is not a consequence of content that is displayed online.
Not an easy task. Let me now become a little bit philosophical with our last question of this interview and ask you, what will be the future of privacy and data protection in the next 20 years?
Thank you. I think there's many different ways to try and answer that question. And the first is to say, if 20 years ago you'd asked me that question, I certainly wouldn't have anticipated where we are now. So any question around 20 years hence in the rapid technologically developing environment we're in is fraught with difficulty. It's speculation beyond 5 to 10 years and maybe even before that. And there are many ways to answer that question, because I think we're at the cusp of some quite extraordinary new developments. I could talk about the emergence of artificial intelligence and large language models, quantum computing, encryption, post-quantum cryptography, and what that will mean. There's a lot of fascinating subjects that we could pick up here. But I guess what I'd say is we're at somewhat of a turning point when it comes to the state of our information environments more broadly. Our online world, as I mentioned earlier, is fundamentally curated and created for us these days. And there is so little content available that it hasn't been either served up to us or algorithmically curated in one way or another, that it's really important for users that they are able to navigate that world with some confidence. And a key aspect of that, I think, and something we've seen a trend towards in recent times, is greater transparency. Transparency about who holds information about users, about the type of choices and tools that are used to provide content to them, and about the way the environments that they operate in have been curated. And there are some very interesting experiments and work underway to try and make that kind of material more readily available to users. I'm thinking about much of the material around reliability of news sources, around transparency, even some of the card systems that some platforms have instituted so people can dial up or down the algorithmic experience they have. I suspect if I were looking out 20 years, let me look at 5 or 10, that we're going to find ourselves at a point where, as societies, we have to try and find a way to become more collaborative and less combative about how we address some of the technological challenges ahead of us. And more focused on the public good, because if we don't, I think we're going to really struggle to sustain the liberal democratic societies that most of us would aspire to, and in which human rights protections, including privacy, are respected and upheld. As I spoke earlier with regard to the Christchurch Call, when we bring tech firms at a leadership level together with government leaders and civil society leaders, the conversation is enriching. It's sometimes very difficult. We describe that sometimes as becoming comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, and that's a maturity process that I think takes a bit of time. On the one hand, for many tech firms, they have a shareholder imperatives and other imperatives they want to drive towards. For many governmental leaders, that represents sometimes almost a visceral assault on the social contract that they're responsible for delivering. And for civil society groups, often it's just important for them to make sure first that their voices are heard, and that can be very difficult. And second, that they are encouraged and indeed sometimes incentivized to deliver the best of the knowledge they have about the experiences they have. I think looking forward, if we can focus on preventing problems rather than seeking to cure them after the fact, we will be in a much, much better space than we have been sometimes with technologies that we've had to learn how to handle previously. I'm thinking about the growth of the public internet, the move towards curated search, the move towards mobility. All of those came with massive societal impacts. The move to social media platforms with curation, that required quite a bit of work to try and get through, and I don't think we've actually resolved all of those issues by any means yet. If we look ahead, large language models, the massive growth of compute power, and I would say the abuse of internet systems by states, by non-state actors, by commercial actors, are all issues that we're going to have to grapple with in the next few years. And I do worry that as we work this through, it's going to be difficult to try and make sure that we're having technologically informed and societally informed conversations in a way that lead to productive outcomes. That's the objective we have in the Christchurch Call. And, I think we really hope in the work we do supporting that community as part of the legacy of what happened on 15 March 2019 here in Christchurch, but also more importantly, as part of the process of helping societies navigate technology better, that we can deal with issues around degradation of information environments and do that in a way that upholds human rights and fundamental freedoms that are particularly important for citizens, users, everyday people to enjoy the protections that you generally equate with liberal democratic societies. We know that's possible if we encourage the right sort of dialogue. It's just, I guess, a real shame that it took something like what happened in Christchurch to get us to the table. And we would hope that with a mixture of regulation, engagement, collaboration, those technological changes can be navigated perhaps more safely than we have some in the past. I'm a fundamental optimist, otherwise I wouldn't be in this job.
Of course, solution has many angles, as you just said. We're getting to the end of this interview. Let me first thank you, Mr. Paul Ash, for your time and for your very useful insights on the subject of privacy and personal data.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It's been a pleasure to join you.
Thank you. Thank you also to our listeners for watching this episode of EDPS Talks series. As always, we invite you to follow our activities on celebrating the 20th anniversary of the EDPS in our website and on social media. In the meantime, you can catch up with previous episodes. My name is Sonia Perez Romero, and I hope to see you next time.